Walk the World's Rim, Chapter 9, Return to the Rim. The high walls and fruit trees muffled the noise of the city. The quiet of the Abbey garden was broken only by the quick rhythmic rasps of the hoes, the soft voices of the brothers, and their occasional laughter. Chaco had spent many afternoons perched in the fruit trees trying to discover the mystery of growing things. He had never heard the brothers sing growing songs or seen them take medicine with the prayer beads. He decided they did such things at night as Aunt Maria's husband did, so he'd abandoned spying on the brothers. Now he was back in the peach tree, but for a different reason. This time he was spying on the slaves working on the cathedral. He shifted carefully on the narrow limb and stared once more at the men clambering about the growing building. How could these plodding, listless men be compared to Esteban? Yet he was a slave as they were. Perhaps the brand made the difference. Esteban had none on his cheek, but neither did the slaves Chaco had seen in his own land. Yet they had the same hopeless look of the branded slaves. He shook his head. Every attempt to find an answer only confused him more. "You are up the wrong tree, lad." Chaco looked down into Brother Solano's grinning face. "If you want yam cakes to take with you," said the cook, "you had better pick a few limes." "Yes, sir." When Chaco carried the small green fruit into the kitchen, Brother Solano picked up his grumbling where he'd left off after the morning meal. "Carrying you off just when there's a little meat on your bones. Fray Marcos never thinks of his stomach. Be sure you set food before him, or he'll never remember to eat. Though only the good Lord knows what those heathens will call food." Chaco grinned. Brother Solano was a good cook, but Aunt Maria could teach him a few things about making tortillas. The thought reminded him of the Pima villages he'd seen after the slave raids. Cabeza de Vaca had complained to the viceroy, and the raids had been stopped. The cruel governor of Culiacan had been removed and Cornedo appointed in his place. That much Chaco had learned from Fray Marcos and the market gossip, but he did not understand why the raids had begun. "Brother Solano, why do the Spaniards make slaves of the Indians?" "Because they revolt against the king's command." That was the truth of the Aztecs, but Chaco could not imagine the Pima revolting. Besides, they had not been under the king's command. Is that the only reason? Some refused to give up their pagan gods and become Christians. But what of the slave raiders? They break the laws themselves. Ask Fray Marcos about them. He fought them in Peru. Such things are beyond me. Here, have a tortilla. Chaco sighed. Food was always the answer when he questioned Brother Solano. It was different with Esteban. If only Chaco could forget him, but he was always in his thoughts like a cactus thorn festering deep in the finger. He could not imagine Esteban surrendering. The Aztecs had. Chaco could see them in the plaza. They were said to be fierce warriors, but Chaco could not be sure. He hadn't known them, but he did know Esteban, and Esteban would fight to the death. He was sure of it. Yet he must have thrown down the spear. If only I knew. He was not aware he'd spoken aloud until Brother Solano answered. "The only way to find the answer is to ask the question. Have another tortilla." They were called They are cold from this morning, but they will fill the stomach. And one cannot ask questions on an empty stomach. Chaco tried hard not to smile. Ah, you see? You are a lad with sense. Why must you go off to the end of the world? Right now I am going only across the plaza. Brother Solano was right in one thing. The only way to find the answer was to ask the question. He found Esteban stacking the hay that Indians were bringing into the stable, loaded on their backs. Esteban glanced down but continued working. Chaco shuffled nervously and wondered how one asked a man to explain his cowardice. "How goes it, Esteban?" he asked at last. "It goes well." Jab went the fork, up went the hay. "We are going to Chibola." Chaco's neck swiveled as he followed each forkful of hay. "So I have heard." Jab, swish. "Must you do that?" Chaco shouted. Esteban rested on the fork. "To be sure, I am, Esteban." Why they do that? Esteban, the valuable property of Captain Andres Durantes, and now rented like an old plow horse to the viceroy. Since a horse needs exercise, my dear viceroy, Esteban can make himself useful by cleaning the stables. The last sentence was a bitter mimicry of Durante's rasping voice. Chaco remembered the same voice, promising to reward Esteban when they reached Mexico. Instead, he was lord of the viceroy's stables. Chaco saw the true meaning of the title Esteban had given himself. He lowered himself to the pile of hay and tried to sort the questions and the means of asking them. The straightest path was the best. "I thought you were a brave warrior." Esteban stared at him. We did no fighting on the trail." "I mean before that, before you were a slave." "I was never a soldier." "Then how were you captured?" Esteban scratched his head, then settled himself beside Chaco in the hay. "Do you remember your village, little one? The starving child with their swollen stomachs, women digging for dry roots, hunters waiting for hours for a rat, a man and a boy grinding fish bones on one stormy night? Do you remember?" Chaco nodded. For the first time in weeks, he saw his village as clearly as if he stood in his father's doorway. Imagine such a place surrounded by a city large as Mexico. A city of great wealth with jeweled minarets gleaming in the sun and temples rich with mosaics. Imagine a family in this poor district, a family with 7 children, all starving in the midst of wealth. What is there to do? Chaco shook his head hopelessly. "The eldest is sold to save the others." "You mean your parents made you a slave?" "It is the custom." "It is a horrible custom." "To be sure, but I held no bitterness until now." Chaco nodded. "I understand. Durante's promised to reward you. I heard him. He said when he got back to Mexico, he would see you were properly rewarded for saving us from the buffalo people." Suddenly he realized what Esteban had expected. "You were sure he would give you your freedom." "Twice he promised, but I know my master. His promises are like rainbows, formed in bad weather and vanishing in a clear sky. But I was sure Cabeza de Vaca would help, or the viceroy himself would give me justice. I shared the hardships with the other 3. For 10 years we shared. What they have done, I have done also. No more, but no less either. But you did do more, Esteban. You saved Durantes and Castillo many times." "Why, Durantes would still be with the buffalo people if it weren't for you, or we'd all have been killed by those tea drinkers. And you were the one with the gift of tongues, the one the tribes welcomed as they would their own. You saved us all." and now I am lord of the Viceroy stables. No wonder Esteban had been angry that first day and had warned Chaco against promises. It seemed the Spaniards might not be as great and honorable as he'd thought, and Chaco did not welcome the knowledge. Better to forget it and turn his thoughts to bring Esteban from his dark mood. We will soon be going to Cibola. Then you'll be out of these stables. Esteban laughed bitterly. Just as I was taken out of Spain, then taken out of Hispaniola, then out of Cuba to Florida. Now I am being taken out of Mexico. His eyes narrowed, and his next words were so low Chaco had to lean forward to hear. So I walked the world's rim once again like a blind horse, chained to a water wheel, around and around with never an ending. I thought you would be glad to be going to Cibola. To be sure, little one, it's a dream come true, but the words were flat and harsh. Esteban stared straight ahead, lost in his thoughts. Chaco rose and brushed absently at his doublet. We leave tomorrow. Things will be better on the trail. Wait and see. Remember Aunt Maria? Perhaps we can trade for more scarecrows. His voice trailed off. Esteban wasn't listening. He seemed to have forgotten Chaco, though he did murmur, "Go with God, little one." Chaco clamped his teeth hard on his lips. He had almost replied, "God have mercy on you," and he didn't know why. It was as if someone else had tried to speak from inside him. Before he entered the crowded plaza, he spat twice over his left shoulder. That night, Chaco waited impatiently until he was sure the brothers were settled for the night. He padded barefooted through the kitchen and into the garden. Behind a sheltering row of beans, he knelt and prayed long to the Spanish God. After the prayers, he opened the medicine bag, formed the circle of life with the dried tea leaves, and worked the magic of his private medicine. When the soft chants had faded in the night air, he made the sign of the cross, buried the used leaves beneath the beanstalks, and crept back to his room. He was ready for the journey to Cibola. The next morning, he knelt in the pre-dawn gloom of the church, shivering in the chill dampness. He was no longer accustomed to running nearly naked. He wore only sandals and a cotton cloth that Esteban had given him in Aunt Maria's village. Beside him, hunched the massive, dark figure of Esteban himself, the familiar gourd rattle in his hand. The bells around Esteban's legs clinked as he rose. Everything was so much like it had been before, and yet it was so different. Chaco followed Esteban into the deserted plaza. Together they watched the soldiers mount. Cornado was to accompany them as far as Culiacan, where Chaco had first seen horses and buildings. There the commander would assume his new duties as governor, but all Mexico knew that as soon as he received Fray Marcos's report, Cornado would be busy assembling the great expedition to Cibola. The soldiers rode off. The hooves of the horses hollow drumbeats on the bridges and dull thuds on the solid road. The two priests followed, their long gray robes dusting their sandal tops. Chaco and Esteban fell into step, and behind them came the Indian porters carrying supplies on their backs. A heavy mist clung to the causeway and beaded Chaco's hair with moisture. Only a few Indians paddling their vegetables to market, paused to watch them leave. A fitting start to our journey, muttered Esteban. It will be better when the sun rises. Chaco heel-hopped a victory dance, partly to raise his friend's spirit and partly to warm himself. He succeeded in neither. Though the mist soon scattered before a chill breeze, heavy gray clouds hid the sun. Before evening, a drizzling rain gathered in rivulets down Chaco's back. They found shelter in one of the buildings the Aztecs had built along the highways for their merchants and tax collectors. All shared the Spanish food that the porters carried for the soldiers. Chaco sipped rainwater and sighed. What one needs on a night like this is chocolate sweetened with vanilla. You are soft, said Esteban. I am not. But he stopped rubbing his aching legs. You are a fat, grain-fed duckling preening his feathers on the Lake of Mexico. And what's wrong with that? Nothing, little one, but beware. Food is always used to bait traps. Chaco tried to dampen his quick flare of anger. Esteban had no right to criticize all Spaniards because of his bitterness toward Dorantes, but Chaco had no wish to quarrel either. He answered lightly, At least if I'm trapping in the abbey, Brother Solano won't let me starve. Esteban shook his head sadly. There are worse things than starving. There was no answer Chaco could give the brooding slave. He curled up, feet to the fire, and hoped that Esteban would be his old self in the morning. But he wasn't. That morning, not that morning or any other. The sun glinted on Cornado's gold helmet, but Esteban's face was dark and gloomy as the day before. Even the bells at his knees had lost their gay jingle and gave forth only an occasional dull clank. Nor did Esteban dance in time to the beat of the gourd rattle. The precious gift from the buffalo people hung from his loincloth thong. In the evening, he held it in his hands, studying it as if he were some strange object he just discovered. It is just the presence of the soldiers, thought Chaco. Once Cornado was left behind in Culiacan, Esteban would sing again and tell stories the way he'd done before. Patiently, Chaco trudged and waited. After leaving Culiacan, Chaco and Esteban took the lead. At midday, Esteban trotted ahead to the next village to arrange food and shelter for the night. Chaco followed more slowly with the priests. As they approached the village, the Indians came out to welcome the priests with the sign of the cross taught them by the three señors. Sleeping places were ready for their use. The best food was set before them. Fray Marcos was delighted, but Chaco could only stare in disbelief. What had happened to the villages since he'd been there? They were much smaller than he'd remembered. The great fields were only poor patches of stunned corn, not anything like the ones he'd seen near Mexico. Even the food disappointed him. The cornmeal was coarse and gritty, the stew flavorless without salt and spices. Most of all, Chaco missed meat. The cotton cloth that had once delighted him no longer seemed a miracle. He couldn't help comparing the plain, narrow strips with the colorful cloths he'd left in Mexico. The woven sleeping mats scratched, and certainly the ground beneath them had hardened since last he slept upon it. The chill drafts could not be closed out, or huts would fill with eye-burning smoke. It was a terrible way to live. It was the way he'd lived most of his life, the way his parents still lived, except they had no cloth or food. To them, a Pima village would be as marvelous as the heaven the priest spoke about. His throat tightened as he remembered his mother's tears that last day and the medicine shell his father had placed around his neck. Then he remembered the winter and the hunger. Most likely his parents were thankful they had one less mouth to feed. And if he could not find comfort in a Pima village, how could Chaco bear the home of his father? The next morning, Chaco set a pace that stretched even Esteban's legs to their limit. What is the hurry, little one? The sooner we get to Chibolo, the sooner I will be back in Mexico. You are thinking of Brother Solano's kitchen. It is all the same. He was sorry he'd eaten the yam cakes so quickly. As long as they'd lasted, Mexico had seemed very near. His own land had faded again from his memory. Perhaps Mexico's wonders would vanish also, and he would be content to eat what Brother Solano called heathen food. Chaco shuddered and pushed forward. Once he returned to Mexico, not even the viceroy would persuade him to leave it again. They soon reached the river where Chaco and Esteban had sailed the boats. They laughed about it over the evening cook fire. Those were good times, sighed Chaco. With a head so full of new, useful things you learned in Mexico, I am surprised that you remember the boats. I remember many things. It was becoming more difficult to smother his anger. Do you remember how it was to climb the mountain passes? The wind in your face and the new land spread out at your feet? Do you remember waking each morning with the day like an empty jar to fill as you pleased? I remember fingers bleeding from digging lizards from frozen ground. My bones remember cold. My stomach remembers the cramp of hunger. That is what I remember and what I wish to forget. You are a fool, snapped Esteban. Then he grinned. But you are a young fool, so there is hope. Chaco's only answer was to move away and curl up by himself. During the night, he woke shivering and decided to forgive Esteban. He groped his way to the ash-coated embers and took his accustomed place against Esteban's broad back. In a few moments, he was warm enough to sleep. He roused once during the night to find nothing behind him but the warm place where Esteban had lain. The gourd rattle bulged reassuringly against his thigh. Esteban would return. He yawned and hugged himself into a ball against the chill. When he woke at dawn, the rattle was gone and Esteban was nowhere in the village.